5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
How can you get real-time intelligence from space rapidly and cheaply? Novi Space is a startup from Virginia that uses its own hardware and on-orbit edge processing to do just that. Their CEO, Michael Bartholomeusz, is our guest this week. Enjoy.
My name is Raphael Rodkin. I'm the founding partner of E2MC, Earth to Mars Capital, a venture capital investor in dozens of space startups worldwide, among other roles I have, such as being a part-time podcast host. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It does not reflect any view by E2MC, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. Before we start, a quick favor. If you do enjoy this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple or Spotify. It does help other people find the podcast. Now on to today's episode.
Hey, space enthusiasts, welcome back to another episode. We have another space startup. Very excited because it's actually from the same neighborhood where my venture capital fund, which you longtime listeners know as my day job, E2MC, is located in Northern Virginia, a place where we love to be. And my guest is Michael Bartholomeusz. I hope I pronounced the last name correctly in the end.
Yes.
And he's from Novi. Welcome, Michael.
It's a pleasure to be here, Raphael. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
It's my pleasure. So, Michael, the way we usually kick this off is we want to give our listeners an idea of what we're actually going to be talking about. And the best way to do that is to get the elevator pitch on Novi, please.
Yes, certainly. So Novi was founded in 2017, and Novi was firmly ensconced in the Department of Defense. And the problem we were solving for the Department of Defense was latency. So putting onboard compute onto satellites, multi-sensor satellites, so the satellites can observe, run AI inference algorithms on board, and send down bits and bytes of insights and intelligence. So the goal is not just to set, the chain of custody changes from observe and send raw data to observe, analyze, and send insights. And of course, you can use small data packet comms channels like Inmarsat and other types of things. So you really drive latency from hours and days down to seconds and minutes. So this was what Novi did. We achieved space heritage, Raphael, earlier this year, and we've got 2 assets in space for the DoD. And now we are launching our dual-use constellation. It's called Genie. It's a constellation of multi-sensor satellites, all that have onboard compute to facilitate analysis and autonomy. And these satellites will collect data, provide insights for both commercial and defense applications.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Okay, I think there's a lot to unpack there for our listeners. I gotta ask you as a first question, because you talked about your defense focus there and the DoD, the US Department of Defense. So I think it's now technically the Department of War, the DOW. I'm just curious whether that has made its way into like daily use when you guys have these conversations or talking to them.
The DoD is so imprinted in my brain that I have
Same.
I have to go through this sort of biological process of reprogramming. So if I call it the DoD, pardon my legacy memory there, it is a Department of War. You're correct.
You're actually the first person I'm asking this because the change was so recent. Anyway, moving on from US government nomenclature. Okay, so you were talking about there sort of the latency in basically Earth observation use cases, but let's unpack that a little bit. Like, I mean, what kind of, obviously without talking about anything classified, can you give us examples what kind of use cases we're talking about here, and sort of as a consequence, what kind of latency would be desirable by the government customer?
Yes, there's actually just this past week, Novi put out a press release. We're running an experiment with the Missile Defense Agency, and it was quite simple, right? There were some ships in an area, and the satellite observed the ships. It characterized the ships and sent the information down in under 8 seconds. So that is very, very profound. So consider a couple of use cases, right? If there's an interest in knowing if planes have left one airfield and gone to another airfield, you don't really need all the raw imagery. You just need some identification of the assets, lat-long coordinates of where they were and where they've gone to. You can do all this data crunching on the satellite, and then you can immediately transmit that information to the asset who cares. And maybe, Raphael, I'll just back off a little bit. Consider the current chain of custody. Satellite sees something, it collects that imagery, sends it down to a base station. And then that information needs to be sent to an air-conditioned room someplace where analysts need to look at it. Now, imagine if you can take that latter part after sensing and do all of that data crunching on board, then you can immediately send down the intelligence that people care about and not just terabytes of raw data. So we sort of see this latency issue is the transition from Earth observation to geointelligence.
Okay, and so does that mean then, as a consequence, if the final product is just an insight, right? I guess at the extreme, that could just be like a text message almost, right? So instead
It
of
could.
maybe having like megabytes of imagery, is that the case that you get down to basically like hundreds of bytes of text?
Exactly. It's lat-long coordinates, it's perimeter coordinates, it's other sort of identifiers, so that when you can shrink that data packet, you don't even need to wait for base station passes, right? So satellites equipped with Starlink modems, and you heard Novi Space is now, onboarding Starlink modems. You can have Inmarsat. You can have some of these other channels that can very directly and immediately send information down.
Okay. And so you mentioned the example of 8 seconds. I find that incredibly impressive, even if it's just text data. Can you walk us through of course, leaving out anything confidential, like what does that look like? How does that get back to Earth in 8 seconds?
Right. So, I mean, I will give you sort of maybe let's take a different example. Just I'll give you a more generic example. So consider a satellite with multi-sensors. It's got optical, hyperspectral, whatever the case is, right? It looks at the world in a bunch of different ways. And it is tasked to go look at a particular area and identify objects. So the satellite flies over. The imaging is very rapid. It's real time, right? Real time imaging, the data is collected. Processing happens very rapidly. These are the objects, these are the coordinates. These are the identified objects, these are the coordinates. Let's say the satellite has a Starlink modem. That information is immediately bounced off the network, and it can be sent to a variety of receivers on ground, and it can be sent to real-time receivers. So that chain of custody is very, very compressed. And you asked for a use case, Rafael, that may have some utility. You look at the modern battlefield. Consider Ukraine, right? That is sort of a crucible right now. Consider a satellite sees something on the battlefield. It sends lat-long coordinates down to an ISR drone that's equipped with a receiver. The ISR drone can fly immediately over that area and then take what action is required. So when you have these latency of seconds, you can now get this very tactical, real-time multi-domain intelligence in action.
So you mentioned the example of the drone there. Is that actually sort of a typical example because that makes it sound like it almost would be ingested directly by a machine and acted on by a machine autonomously, or would there typically be a human receiver of this type of data?
Well, I think what the satellite could do is find areas of interest, objects, task the drone to go take a look at them. But you would imagine that you would want a human being in that chain of custody, at least as this technology matures. And so these could be FPV or first-person type view drones, and there could be there certainly could be human beings and operators in the chain of custody.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me, right? Because it always sounds a little bit scary if, say, very high impact decisions would be taken just on like a text alert, right? Somebody would probably want to go back. Okay, can I see the actual image that's of this very dangerous thing that we thought is happening here or not? Okay, and so
Rafael, let me maybe just interrupt you for 1 second, because you actually brought up quite an insightful point. A lot of times you do want to have the raw imagery as backup, right? So you consider the satellite, it collects the imagery, sends the insight. Then at a base station pass, it can send out a larger data packet of actually what it saw. And it doesn't have to send the whole image. It can send the cropped image or some processed imagery of what it saw. So again, there is some reference, there is some imagery reference if it is required. So just because you have intelligence autonomous satellites doesn't mean they've just got to send down insights and intelligence. They can send down raw processed data. It just depends what communication channel and what latency is tolerable.
And so the architecture and the kind of processing you're describing to basically go down from an image to like a very much smaller bite size of actionable insights sounds very kind of obvious to me, like when you describe it now. Why has this not happened yet? Was that because of limitations of onboard computing, or were there any other reasons?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, there were legacy and technology reasons, right? I think when the initial satellite, and especially commercial satellite operators started, really Earth observation was the focus. Look at the world around us, send all this data. and people would analyze it. But I think, at the time, AI wasn't as prominent 10, 20 years ago. Inference algorithms weren't as sophisticated, and computing was larger, more cumbersome. So I think you had to sort of wait for this convergence of software development, computing power and micronization. All of these things needed to converge to now take autonomy to the edge. And so I think a lot of it was just a timing thing. In the last few years, to a certain degree, Novi was at the right time, at the right place, right? We were developing this sort of onboard compute and autonomy right when software and technology capability converged.
And can you talk us a little bit more through precisely the technology you're developing? So is this on the hardware side or the software side or both? Or is it even beyond that, sort of the entire system to capture the data, process it, and get it back to the ground?
Yes, let me try to unwrap that a little bit. So at Novi, we look at ourselves sort of as an infrastructure company, right? So we make the satellites, we launch and manage mission. These satellites have multi sensors, RGB, hyperspectral, high res. So the constellation will have a broad variety of sensors. We don't make the sensors. These are sensors that we purchase and integrate into the satellite. What we make are the brains of the satellite, the onboard compute. Novi makes the onboard compute. We use the AMD Versal architecture. And so we make the smart satellites, integrate in the sensors, and then build in the avionics and all of that. So, but we are the infrastructure layer, Rafael. What we do is our users, whether they be military or commercial, upload their algorithms and get the results. We host it. It's kind of like an AWS, and if you look at how we price it, we also use that EC2, that elastic pricing. You get longer term customers, burst customers, they can upload their algorithms, they can task the satellite, and then based on how much they utilize the infrastructure and the resource, they've got dynamic pricing that they can exploit.
And so that means you are, if I heard you correctly, you are developing the onboard computer, though that is part of your technical expertise.
Yes, and actually more than that, right? Our onboard computers are TRL-9. They're already in orbit for the Department of War. And we are, in addition to the infrastructure layer, we discreetly sell our onboard computers to a variety of customers in defense and commercial because it is a very advanced low swap product. Yes, so we develop it, we're using it in our own infrastructure, we use it for defense missions, and we are selling it to commercial and defense customers because we're great believers in enabling space autonomy.
And so why did you decide that? So there's obviously a lot of Earth observation satellites up there already, and it seems like we constantly have more Earth observation satellites going up by new startups, many of them well financed, and there's ever more sensor types, right? Started with optical, then we had radar, thermal infrared, now we have hyperspectral, we may have things after that. How did you guys come to the decision that your own satellites were required, rather than saying hosting your OBC, your onboard computer, on somebody else's existing satellites?
I think so. So you are correct. I think the caveat is that the industry is so fragmented, right? So you've got different satellites with different sensors that are non-coincidental. So sure, you can get data from different sensors, but it all has to be fused in on Earth, which is cumbersome, costly, and laborious. The other is, a lot of these satellites are extremely expensive, and if we're setting up the infrastructure layer, we can't rely on other timetables, on other tasking. It just becomes very convoluted. We can make these, our satellites are 6 to 16U. They're very compact, very high powered. They have coincidental multi-sensors. And since we manage the whole chain, we can make them at a fraction of a cost, as opposed to either having contract manufacturers or trying to host our OBCs on other constellations that have other priorities. So part of it is, if we're the infrastructure layer, we have to create and manage the infrastructure. The other is, we really believe, at least in commercial space, that the data rights business model is broken. So today, if you buy data, you don't really own it. You don't have free license to do with it what you want to do with it. There's lots of constraints and licensing agreements and carve-outs. I would say in commercial space, apart from cost, which is a real impediment, data rights and data ownership is a real impediment. So with edge processing, Rafael, we can reduce costs by multiples, an order of magnitude. So we can solve the cost problem for users. The other thing that platform allows for is liberal data rights. Consumers and users own the data that they task and acquire, and they can free trade in that data. They can sell it. They can use it unfettered. So we believe that owning our own platform allows us to address what we believe are the two biggest impediments as you transition from Earth observation to geointelligence, which is cost and data rights, and of course, coincidental sensor suite.
And so what types of sensors does that mean in reality? You guys decided that you needed to have to serve the use cases you want to serve?
And there's two levels to that. So when we look at the different markets for both military and commercial, really the prevalent sensors are RGB, then hyperspectral, typically up to very near IR, shortwave IR bands, and thermal IR, right? So that covers agriculture, maritime, forestry, a whole bunch of different things. Our constellation, of course, we can't put 6 sensors on a satellite unless it's going to be the size of a small school bus or a car. So what we have is a blended constellation. Some satellites will have a combination of RGB and hyperspectral. Others will have high resolution. Others will have shortwave IR. So there is a degree, if people want to fuse data, there's still a degree of data fusion that needs to occur. But typically users are using a particular sensor type. So we will cover a very broad range of sensors in a blended constellation.
And so does that mean, well, if you have one of your satellites, would that be, I guess on the Department of War, my guess is the satellite is just be used by the Department of War, but correct me if I'm wrong. But for the commercial customers, does that mean you like several customers would be sharing satellites potentially?
Yes, it's very much like AWS, right? So in AWS, you go and you select a server and you select, there's a priority associated with it. It's the same thing here. You will select a sensor. So in the case of this infrastructure, you're selecting a sensor. That sensor is supported by a bunch of satellites. And then depending on the priority and duration of depending on the duration and quantity of your tasking, you're given a priority. So everyone's sharing the platform, and it actually is dual use, Raphael. So both the government and the commercial space, commercial users will be able to use it. Clearly, if government needs dedicated resources, we have dedicated government programs to support that. But the Genie platform for less unitary government requirements and Department of War requirements, they will be able to access the platform.
So let's talk actually a little bit about the non-DOW, Department of War use cases. Because for Department of War, in certain situations in theaters, or my extreme example always is sort of Golden Dome missile defense. I mean, those are examples where I immediately, and I think anyone would immediately intuitively see the importance of low latency, and the lower the better, the faster the insight, the better. But what are some examples of non-national security use cases where low latency is actually important?
Absolutely. I'll take a stepping stone. I'll sort of transition from Department of War there. Remember, autonomous satellites, it's not just about, geointelligence. It's also about domain awareness, right? Once you have smart satellites with sensors, you can look around. There's threat detection. There's domain awareness. So just within the context of DOW, it is beyond simply Earth observation and multi-domain with air and ground assets. There's a space domain awareness element to that. Now, commercial applications. I mean, for 10 years, people have been talking about all the usual suspects, right? There's agriculture and trading and maritime and all I think those are the applications, right? Crop health, food security, illegal fishing fleets, getting a jump on trading and trends and counting cars in Walmart parking lots.
This is true. Sorry to interrupt you, but many, and I've been following this. So in a previous life, I was working at a hedge fund, and I remember when satellite, like you mentioned, the counting cars and parking lots. Like hedge funds, of course, was some of the first users of that, and there's literally it's the early 2010s. So this is like a long time ago. But that, I mean, if I stick with that example, there certainly wasn't any need for very low latency. It was kind of good to get it the same day, but you didn't need it like within minutes, let alone seconds. So I guess my question is, like, among these myriad use cases, like everyone agrees there's myriad use cases for Earth observation, but which of the commercial ones actually require like low latency?
Right. Well, there's actually another element to that. In solving the latency problem for the Department of War, we solve the cost problem for commercial space. Because really, commercial space, yeah, there are some applications like safety critical and fire that care about latency. But the reality is commercial space will be enabled by a dramatic reduction in cost, right? It's like all these devices. When the cost goes down, adoption goes up. And I think that's been the problem in commercial space, is as cost has hindered adoption. So it is the domain of large enterprises who can afford this data. So really, when we come to commercial applications, it's a subtle but key point. putting onboard compute solves the cost problem. So now medium-sized, small-size enterprises can use this data. But beyond that, it is unleashing an ecosystem of users and use cases that we can't even comprehend of today. So I'll give you one example, and this is an example. This is me contemplating it over a glass of wine. But imagine now if you can have sensors in space that can take images or even take video. Well, videos has a latency issue, but take images. These images can go to Google Glasses. You can have the gamification of space if it is cheap enough, right? It's the same thing smartphones precipitated with mobile phones. You put an onboard compute onto a box with sensors, and you opened up this amazing ecosystem of applications. So this is really what we're looking in the commercial sector. Drive price down, open adoption. There are going to be some safety critical applications that benefit from latency, but everyone benefits from a cost driver. And then you set up an application, you democratize the use of geointelligence to set up use cases and that probably haven't been thought of today.
And just to make sure we have this right, the pricing comes down because the cost comes down because you no longer send like tons of images to Earth. You just send like the analyzed insights to Earth. Is that?
That is correct. And give in a nod to your prior life, I'll just give an example for what it is. This is just a like sort of thought example. Counting ships in Baltimore Harbor. Let's say a company wants to count ships every day for a year in Baltimore Harbor. That's 365 data points. Today, to download the imagery, purchase it, and then have an analyst firm do it, the price tag for a year is about 150K. We can do that for about $700. Think about the price disruption there. 150K, $1,000, right? That's the kind of profound price disruption that just sending the intelligence that's required and not flooding users with all the data they don't care about makes.
Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense. That was going to be the next question about the pricing, but it's a very nice example you gave there. So again, we were talking about before a little bit some of the reasons why this hasn't happened so far, and you, I think, explained clearly why in terms of the availability of hardware and the algorithms. So I guess the next question along that line now would be like now that you describe it like that, it seems like a completely obvious thing to do. Like, why aren't more people doing it?
Well, I think they are, right? I mean, Planet has now announced that their upcoming Owl constellation will, they plan to have onboard compute. I think, companies like Satellogic are hosting some onboard compute. I think, I heard one pundit say Earth observation is dead, and now everything is about Earth monitoring. And you're even seeing firms like picking up those sort of little sound bits, Earth monitoring. And, we've always firmly called ourselves geointelligence because we're not Earth observation. But yeah, I think it's here. I think it has to come, and it is coming, and people have made those announcements. But I think part of the problem, Rafael, is when you look at the first movers who moved into Earth observation, and thank goodness for them, they've opened up the market, the real pioneers. But the sheer amount of money they took in to open up the market is like a ball and chain, right? It's a capital ball and chain on their balance sheet, which even as they transition to edge processing, they can't quite shed, and is going to be an impediment to the type of drastic price reductions this industry needs. And so I think there's going to be a lot of next generation operators, infrastructure players, and smart space players like Novi who are going to come in and disrupt the space, no pun intended, because we have clean sheet structures and business models.
How do you think this is going to evolve over sort of the medium time frame? Because right now you have the sort of the onboard computers and the edge processing there, and then like sort of sending it back to Earth. But of course, there's also like more and more people, rightly or wrongly, talking about like entire space data centers. I think that expression has different meaning to different people. But anyway, I put it out there anyway. Is that something you see where things are going in the medium term?
I mean, so the first thing is, geointelligence to a certain degree is different from data centers in space, right? One is about real-time observing and insight delivery. The other is data centers in space. So these are pretty, now they can leverage and use each other at some point in time. Now you have a lot of pretty profound people who are getting behind data centers in space for a variety of reasons. And I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know my sense of the matter is I probably won't bet against some of the people who are espousing this, but I think it's a long game. I don't think it's going to be here in 3 and 4 years, right? To have real data centers in space being able to do the heavy lifting that data centers on Earth do, we're probably a decade or more out on that.
Yeah.
That's just personal opinion.
Yeah. And I take your point on that. To some extent, they're slightly different. I mean, I think the data center driver is more on the sort of taking advantage of, obviously, of solar power in space. But to some extent, also there could be an overlap, right? Because, I mean, you're talking about, your own satellites with sensors, but I guess there could be hypothetically a future where you just, like, there's a data center and it just collects data from many, many different types of satellites with many different sensors from different places, and you fuse and analyze the data in such a space data center, and then it gets sent back. I guess that's something that could ultimately happen.
Absolutely, right. So if you look at constellations like Novi, you see there's sort of the thousand brain concept, right? You got 1,000 brains. It doesn't matter where they ultimately, what node they feed into. That node can be in a space data center, it can be in an Earth data center. It doesn't really matter. Data centers are, receptors of information and integration and fusion and training and all of that. It doesn't really matter whether they're terrestrial or celestial.
And so, in terms of your own satellites and your own constellation, I mean, what kind of size do you want to get to? What kind of size of constellation makes sense in your mind?
I think what we're looking at is, I'll just throw some rough numbers out there, but we've got military assets in space, but our Genie constellation, our first two satellites go up in the first half of next year. We're already manifest on transport emissions, and we plan to proliferate to about 40 satellites exiting 2028, going into 2029, which is a nice number because it gives you sub-daily revisit rates. So for a lot of the commercial applications, it gives you that very high revisit and allows you now to engage in dynamic intelligence. But even with 2, 3, 4 satellites, you start to get revisit rates that are quite compatible with a lot of use cases that don't require daily or sub-daily revisit rates.
And so once you have those satellites in space and sort of producing data, I mean, what does your go-to-market look like? And again, leaving aside the Department of War, because that's always, of course, a special case. But on the commercial side, what's the go-to-market? Is there certain, for example, industry verticals you think make more sense to start with, that have more need for data or maybe understand it easier?
The customer will dictate that. So we provide the infrastructure layer, right? So we provide the infrastructure layer, and it's just going to be a question of adoption dynamics, which we don't know. We don't have the detailed understanding of the verticals that the individual vertical players have. We offer the infrastructure, and then the verticals who adopt it, that will sort of direct how the constellation evolves and grows. It'll be very market and user driven. Now, go to market. So you look at user adoption, that's sort of as you're inflecting and growing. But from an adoption standpoint, as we discussed, Raphael, Earth monitoring, geointelligence, Earth observation, very fractured market. So we are really working with the analytic firms or the data provider firms, the firms today who are squashed between the operators and the users. And they're squashed from a pricing level and they're squashed from a data rights level. We're offering this platform to them, which gives them a great economic advantage and liberal data rights. And these will be the folks who we're looking at as our initial customers because they already own the end users, right? They're selling millions and millions of terabytes, petabytes, whatever the case is.
Yeah, you answered my next question there, I think, because I was going to ask you if you go directly to the customer, but that makes sense that you don't. Because, I mean, again, Department of War is a special case, but if you kind of pick your average person in, I don't know, agriculture, insurance, I mean, most of them, like, they don't even know what satellite or planet is, and neither do they really have to be honest, in their day job. So you answered my question here. You go to existing intermediaries. I guess this would be like consulting firms or large data firms like a Bloomberg or something like that.
It could even, you've got a lot of firms today who offer imagery, right? The whole reseller market. And if you could go, you figure the reseller firms, they're selling into all industries. So the platform can offer them raw imagery, it can offer them clipped imagery, and then it offers them the ability to expand their value chain by now offering tasking to generate insights, uploading software. So really, you're right. It could be firms who are offering, multi-domain data fusion and insights to enterprises. It could be data resellers who are looking to improve their economics and maybe now start to offer insight and geointelligence services. So it's those types of firms.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned their upcoming launch, first half of next year. Is that, I assume that is the next big milestone, or what are the next exciting milestones at Novi?
So, I mean, certainly with the Department of War, we've got some pretty exciting internal milestones. And but milestones, of course, we can't
Yes.
articulate publicly. But yeah, that's that's the next milestone for Novi. We've got our heads down, and now we start launching our satellites and proliferating the constellation. There's a subtle point to what you brought up. We look at our government business sort of as our safe harbor and core, right? Still 45% of share of wallet is with government. And so part of what we're doing is being very premeditated. As we launch our constellation, we're not driving towards a cliff. We've got a very robust government business, so we can look at the market, we proliferate, we can throttle down, we can throttle up, we can change sensor suites. So we're in a very strong position to curate how we penetrate and grow in the commercial market because we can always fall back on our defense safe harbor.
By the way, this government market, is that because you're working so closely with the Department of War in the US, are there any restrictions to you working with, let's say, other governments? Like, let's assume they're allied. Obviously, let's not assume they're adversaries.
I think yes. So within reason, right? So there will be certainly since we are a dual use company, there are restrictions like ITAR and export control and other types of constraints, and also with image sensors, right? You see firms already, having to deal with certain constraints around very high resolution image sensors. So yes, we're going to have to navigate some of those, but we will be able to work, I believe, with friendly governments. We will be able to work with the broad commercial sector, but we're going to have to make sure we're in compliance with all applicable laws.
Okay, so coming back to, or I guess following on from the milestones. So if you look a little bit further out, so let's say a 10-year time frame or so, what is the vision for Novi, the company? Where does the company want to get to in an ideal world?
I mean, really, the vision for Novi is this in space. What is a satellite? It's a box with sensors, and we're now putting a brain onto it. So the vision for Novi is you have this proliferated constellation of satellites that can be tasked by all users to look at any point in the world at very rapid revisits and transfer geointelligence back for the benefit of commercial applications, of government applications, and we believe ultimately this is going to set up a very vibrant ecosystem of applications in a marketplace, very much like the app stores today. It's instead of sensors on Earth, you're going to have sensors on space. And because it's an infrastructure, people will be able to upload apps and then sell and monetize those apps. So we really see that direction. That's a swing for the fences.
That's a very interesting comparison, though, if you talk about the App Store, though, because famously with that case study, which has been the Apple App Store case study, which has been used for many different things across the business world, it's a marketplace, right? And so as any marketplace, you have to kickstart it. And of course, Apple, there was like an initial suite of apps that Apple just developed and put in there. Is that something that has any relevance or transferability to Novi's case as well? Do you guys feel like, okay, maybe we should kind of do like a handful of really cool applications ourselves and kind of push them onto the market because you believe there is a market, but a market that may not understand it enough that this is possible?
Yeah, that's very insightful, and that's exactly right. So you asked before, what are we? Are we hardware? Are we software? So, and I mentioned we're an infrastructure company, but we also have a strong software competency, and you're absolutely right. Our marketplace will initially be hosted also by some of our apps. We have other developers we're working with who are interested in hosting their apps on our marketplace. So we would very much like the App Store is probably 90% or 95% third-party apps today and 5% indigenous apps. We will sort of seed it in the same manner.
Okay. And is there any examples of first apps you can already talk about, or is it too early for that?
Well, I think one of the apps that again you saw in the PR now, even though that was more on the government realm, is maritime ship detection, right? You want to look at a harbor and understand, do you have cruise liners, do you have yachts, do you have warships? What do you have there? That's of interest to people in the maritime domain. So you could imagine apps around that. You could imagine, I'll give you it's almost a silly example, right? You look at places like Buffalo, New York, right? Where as summer comes, people start opening up their pools. Now imagine if there was an app that could constantly say these pools are opening up at these addresses, then local pool companies, instead of going and leaving flyers on everyone's driveway, they'll know exactly who to go target and go, do you need pool service? So you can look at even very prosaic and mundane things like that. Once the price comes down significantly, you can start developing apps that allow space-based commerce in ways we haven't thought about today. So these are the types of apps: object recognition, insight communication, dynamic change management. These are the apps that we envision and in fact are working on.
Okay. And I stay with the Apple comparison. Apple obviously makes it I shouldn't say that, maybe reasonably easy for a developer community to access the data through APIs, to like emulate it, to simulate applications and so forth. Is that something on your mind already, how you develop this developer community and make it easy for people to start apps?
Yeah, so we already have, as I mentioned, if you look at our commercial structure, again, it's very much like an AWS EC2 type thing mostly for enterprise customers. But for application developers, yes, they're given a sandbox, they're given a software developer kit, they train their models on Earth, upload their models, and the plan is we take a cut of their monetization of their applications on the marketplace. So it's very, very similar.
Okay,
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please do.
So is there already like I don't know, website or something like interested developers can go to today and start talking to Novi and developing apps, and there's an API and all of this?
So today, right, this is all being orchestrated. We plan to have it in the next 5 to 6 months as our constellation goes live. So at this point, interested developers just reach out to us via our website. So we're doing it we've got beta customers, so we're being selective. We're getting some beta customers. We're starting to pressure test the various constituents of customers, but this should become pretty turnkey, as we go into mid of next year.
Terrific. And yeah, we'll put your website in the show notes for anyone interested in that. Michael, our last question is always the same in this podcast, which is about science fiction. And if you like science fiction, and if so, then favorite science fiction. And it could be movies or books or TV shows.
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the question without answering the question, because it's not so much science fiction that I am passionate for, but historical fiction. I really enjoy historical fiction, and I think two of the authors who I've devoured their books are Michael and Jeff Shaara. And Michael Shaara wrote The Killer Angels, which was about Gettysburg, and they've written extensively about U.S. history. But I love historical fiction because it sort of takes the facts and makes them very much alive in the first person and makes it very dynamic. So I'm not a huge science fiction fan, but I love historical fiction. I hope I don't disappoint.
No, it's a different answers, and as long as our guests are suggesting books, this is I think helpful to our listeners. Michael, thank you so much for taking some time to introduce Novi to our listeners and what you guys are doing and the exciting things you're up to. Best of luck with everything, including the first launch next year, and I hope all goes well, and maybe we'll speak again in a couple of years or so and see where you guys
Absolutely. It was a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for taking the time.
And that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. And once more, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. We're also on LinkedIn under the Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may even include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in becoming a sponsor, or really for any other suggestions, you can drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you for the next episode.